Let's see if we came back. Are we here? Apologies for the technical difficulties. A ghost chair at the beginning here. There we are. Yes, there we go. A little bit of technology on a Friday. Happy to have you. Happy Friday. It's just me. Bob's not here. Bob has a conflict this morning, and last week I said Bob and I would be back to follow up on some questions. Bob couldn't be here this week to follow up some questions. Next week, we will. We've already started talking about this. We're going to have to do it after 12 o'clock Central next week, but Bob is available after 12 o'clock Central next week so that we can be here to do a live together. So next week, I know I said this week, next week we will be here together to do a live. But because we did have some questions regarding things from the chat last time, Constellation Pegasus, some of your homework, I didn't want to avoid it, to throw it to the side, to let it fall out of my mind. So I'm going to follow up with that question and then follow up with a couple questions that came from this week's podcast all about Elephantine. And this is something that came from one of the lives where we were talking about, hey, what kind of stuff might you want to see? What topics might you want to see in the future? That's what led to this week's episode with Dr. James Moore. If you liked that episode, if you haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend going and checking it out. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's an interesting turn that feels a little bit different than some of what you might see other places if you are trying to find stuff on what's happening with these materials. Dr. Moore's reading is a little bit different than some of the other readings you might find in the scholarly community. I don't think, though, that as much of it may feel as different or is really as different as it might seem. Some of those updates around like mercenary language and things, right? That's something we've had some questions on in comments because that's a change. That's something you usually hear about this. But Dr. Moore really does a lot of framing of this. Well, let's talk about this community, these texts in the Persian period, and what does that do? So I loved that interview. They have a lot of materials out there, published materials, some journal articles. They've got a great edited volume that I put in the description of that podcast from Brill about papyri. They are elbows deep in the materials there. So if you are looking for stuff, I'd say go check that one out. But Constellation Pegasus, I wanted to come back to your question from last week about the shamir. And so you had thrown a question in about basically what is this? What's going on with this? Now, full disclosure, as I said last time, this was one of those names that I'm like, I don't really know. I don't really know this name, but I'm happy to go look around. And so I did. So this is what we have. So if you are in the same camp where you're saying, I've never heard of the shamir before, what is this? This is in rabbinic tradition. This develops in later materials, especially within the Talmud and the Mishnahs, of like this worm that Solomon used to help in the construction of the temple. That there was a worm that Solomon used, right? That's the base thing you need to have. There's a worm that Solomon used in order to help construct the temple. Hey, K. Tempest Bradford, not late. You're just getting here for Constellation Pegasus' question of the shamir. So why does Solomon need a worm to help build the temple? Well, maybe not even just like a worm. Let's just start with why does Solomon need something to help build the temple? And not just because Solomon is one individual, supposedly in the memory of the text, that can't build the temple all by themselves, but we can turn to texts, specifically things like Exodus 20:25 and 1 Kings, to get the grounding for why a tradition is going to develop that says Solomon uses something to help cut stones, because the shamir is this worm that is capable of eating through hard things like stone, of chewing through stones and gems in a way that is mystical, magical, unique, divine. It gets connected with one of the things that's created in the creation week in larger traditions. So why do you need to have something like this to help you in the construction of the temple? Well, if we go to Exodus 20:25, we get the verse, right? This is from Decalogue materials. We were just talking about this in the bonus podcast. If you are interested in more, not shamir connected, but just Exodus 20. Exodus 20:25. But if you make for me an altar of stone, do not build it of hewn stones, for if you use a chisel upon it, you profane it. So we have this here connected to altars, saying no chiseling, no hewing of stones when you build altars. The temple as a sacred space, which is also going to have altars, they look back to this in later communities to say, okay, if that was the rule there around altars, why would it not also apply to all of the sacred precincts. That is the temple, right? Fences around the Torah. If it applies to that, it should also apply to this. It's something you can see continued on when we turn to 1 Kings 6:7. The house was built with stone, finished at the quarry, so that neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron was heard in the temple while it was being built. So there it doesn't say they didn't use those tools, but that it was worked on, finished somewhere else, transported over, and then assembled. But later communities come in to say, well, if we have this thing saying no chisels, no hammers, nothing on the stones, how is Solomon able to do that? What makes this different? Why doesn't that create a problem? So they look around the text, they look through as they are wont to do, and they find these references to something known as a shamir. You get 3 of these that are connected to this thing that is capable of making an impression or cutting through hard stone. We get it in Jeremiah 17:1, Ezekiel 3:9, and Zechariah 7:2. So Jeremiah 17:1, the sin of Judah is written with an iron pen, with a diamond point, and the word diamond there is this word shamir. With a diamond point, it is engraved on the tablet of our hearts. So there, it gets connected to this thing that has the ability to carve stone, but because it shows up so rarely, it's not really well defined with what this is. Ezekiel 3:9, like the hardest stone, harder than flint. Okay, so now this thing that can carve into stone is even harder than stone. And so from this, and then in looking back at, well, we need to have something, you can't cut it with this, maybe this can be used. And so it becomes the thing that Solomon can use to hew the stones so that you're not using a chisel or a hammer upon them. And it is this worm that is created on the eve of Sabbath at the creation night, says Pirkei Avot, so that this worm gets made that can chew through stone. And that's what Solomon uses. With the help of fetching it, let's say, he's able to get this divinely created worm with the help of Asmodeus, right, within the demonic realm, summoning demons to say, help me get this thing to then do the construction of the temple. And so then the worm is the thing that chews the stones within the tradition, chews the stones so that no hammer is used upon this. And then it lives in most cases until the destruction of the temple when it's no longer around, because you need it through, right, the ongoing life of the temple so that it continue to be used for repairs. So that is the short and kind of quick background of what this thing is. Yes, some thought it could be a green crystal. Absolutely. So this is the outgrowth of, with its odd uses and what can be used in this way, it grows into its interpretive traditions, let's say, continues to grow in more and more ways as it seeks to address more needs from its origin story, from its uses. This one, thank you so much for sending this along, because this does feel like one of these very interesting instances where out of, right, if you look at 2 verses like Exodus 20:25 and 1 Kings 6:7, Exodus 20:25 really at the core there. How do we go from this in light of something else? And where do these explanatory traditions emerge from? There's always a kernel in there somewhere that is, there's a verse, there's a rule, there's something that we need to be mindful of so that we're not transgressing upon this. And then something else, there's a reference over here to something that can make an impression in stone. The shamir is also the thing within the tradition that gets associated with Moses. Moses uses it to engrave the names of the tribes on the gemstones that are a part of the high priest's materials, the ephod, so that it is able there, getting connected in even before Solomon. In this, it can engrave. How are we going to do that? We had this thing that's capable of doing this until we no longer have it anymore. But because it has this unique power, unique ability, it's not a natural kind of this worldly thing. That's where we get traditions that it is one of these things created on the eve of the Sabbath of creation at twilight, one of these 10 things like writing and the tablets and letters that is made there. So it has this early origin story to explain some of its ability to do things. So Constellation Pegasus, thank you so much for the question. Fascinating. And I did also get your other note because I think that's a good topic that would be nice for a whole podcast episode in and of itself. Remember, if you have questions for us like this, always happy to have you here to live. If you are watching live, put a question in. Happy to talk to you as we go through. If you are watching live on replay and you're like, I missed it, I can't, you move them around. They do move around kind of depending on schedules. If you can't be here live, you can leave a question in. I go back and check. You can join us on Patreon. You can send questions in that way. You can send us questions via our email. It's down in the description, Bible-Archaeology@uiowa.edu. Leave questions in podcast episodes. Looking around, we can follow up with the things that you are interested in, that we're interested in, that we can fill this gap in between. Because in that way, as I mentioned at the beginning, that's where like this week's episode came from in talking about Elephantine and why we scheduled it in, why we kind of covered some of the stuff that we did. And so something within that I want to return to, because I was thinking this week, like, it'd be kind of nice to use, if we do lives more regularly on Fridays, like a return to the episode, like a discussion after the show type of thing. And so you're here. If you have questions about this week's episode, let me know. But kind of a debrief at the end, what you thought, what you liked, other things that didn't make the cut, all that kind of stuff. But something that we got a question on that I made a short for yesterday, but I think is worth a little bit more time, is regarding the idea that they're mercenaries. This is one of those commonly held beliefs about the community at Elephantine, is that they were a mercenary community. And we have this grounded, as I mentioned yesterday, we have this grounded in the very real fact that there are these military terms inside the texts. So within these papyri, this community is referred to with military language. And so if you're looking at that and you're turning towards the Hebrew Bible to help translate what we have in these Aramaic papyri, or if you're turning towards a context for the Hebrew Bible, as I mentioned, like the Assyrian period, that is military, it means military. And so for a lot of these early scholars, who, as we talked a little bit about with Dr. Moore, are reading these papyri very much through the lens of the Hebrew Bible, you can see how they applied that across. And so it's not that they came up with that out of nowhere. That has a grounding in the references that appear. But Dr. Moore's argument, and I think it's a very interesting one, is that is misapplying our understanding of that terminology, that we need to not look within that older context, the maybe Assyrian period context, but how that has been developed through the Babylonian and then into the Persian period. And so within the Persian period, this term that is military in nature does get used for groups that are state dependents of different levels. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have military functions, but that terminology still gets used because of some of that relationship that they have back and forth. And for Dr. Moore, this led to fit in, let's say, this fit in with his reading of this group as one of these colonial enterprises of the Persian Empire. And so you can see some ways that those systems carry over time as these empires build one upon the other and take things from older systems to say, we're going to continue using that part, and maybe we're going to make some changes, or maybe we're going to throw things away, and that language stays on. But we have other problems with trying to understand them as a military community. And this is something that regularly gets discussed when that comes up, because we don't have descriptions of them doing the types of things you would expect a garrison community, a militia community, a military group to be doing. If they're a mercenary group, where are the discussion, the descriptions, the events that accompany that? We have lots of description of life and activity, but we don't have discussions of things that would align with that. We also don't have the type of archaeological evidence that would seem to support this type of concern. If they're a mercenary group, where's the archaeology to support that? Where are their weapons? Where's all of that material? And a very interesting note in this too is these ranks that get described are not just male in nature, right? There are women who are listed in these ranks within the Elephantine papyri and in the Persian period. That's not something that would be happening inside a militia group, inside a military group, inside a garrison. And so all of these are reasons why Dr. Moore proposes we need to rethink how we're understanding this mercenary community, how we're understanding them as being that at all, and update that language in light of what the texts say, what the archaeology says, what the Persian period tells us, to say, okay, they're using these terms, but that doesn't necessarily describe the actions that they're doing. So that was one of the parts that we did touch on it. I think there's a timestamp with this one, but a lot of these little elements from these materials, that is like how old scholarship has continued to influence, and sometimes because of like the weight of those early ideas, that weight can be really heavy to move. And so you read it and it continues on until someone proposes something new. And usually the person that proposes something new takes a lot of pushback from people who are continuing to support that older idea. And we'll see how this expands over time. But I think it does address a number of concerns or questions about what we have within those papyri and within those materials. So just something I wanted to circle back to from that interview. Again, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, if you're waiting for the weekend to listen to, great idea. I think it's a really fun one. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I mean, there's certainly even like more to come back to, because this was, I don't know, I'd say like it's an introductory cover. And there's places that we can dive into more deeply in the future, should you have an interest. So if you're watching through that one and you're like, oh, you touched on this, but I'd really love to hear even more on this aspect of this thing, let us know. Send us an email, put it down in the comments of that video, and I'll go back through, I'll take a look through, and we can see where we go from there. Because as we're looking out over the next year's kind of things, there's a couple of topics that I want to return to, a couple of guests that I want to return to as well. So if you have ideas in that way, where you're saying, hey, you talked to so-and-so, I loved that interview, could you get them back on, whether it's for a follow-up or for something different, let us know, because we've had a lot of really good people on this last year. Yeah, I do think it was a great interview. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. I mean, not great for my half, but like the material, like it was so good sitting there listening through. You're like, this is so much wonderful material. I'm so glad they were able to fit it in. It's a busy time of year for academics, conference season's coming up, Thanksgiving and Christmas and all those things. So very happy that they're able to make their way to join us, to have that with you. But if there are people like that you want to cycle back in, that you're looking back over last year's calendar of guests and you're just like, hey, I'd love this person to come back around, let us know. I'm always happy to email people again to chat some more. I love to talk to all of them. So let us know. You may not be able to answer this right now. We'll find out if there's a connection between, so are there, I don't know off the top of my head if there is a connection between the Therapeutae and the Elephantine community. I don't know. It's not something that we discussed. And thinking through some of the stuff from Dr. Moore, I don't know. And this is one of those things, we've had some comments on this on that podcast too, right? Regarding our understandings of these communities and who is sectarian or who's not sectarian. How do we use that language itself? When are things connected and when are they not? How much might we know? Something that Dr. Moore talks about and something that we'll be talking about, I guess it's in next week's interview with Dr. Klein about the Amarna letters, is we have hard times sometimes with what we have left is what we can know. So when we're looking at these type of textual materials, we can only judge based off of what we have. People can make assumptions or arguments off of that to say maybe there's other things around this or there's concerns, but when we have gaps, when we don't have the things, then we don't have the things. So off the top of my head, I'd say I don't know. It's not one that I'm familiar with, but I mean, I can certainly say let's look around, and if I find something good, then we can look through. And so let me say that'll go on the to-do list as a question to poke and maybe to follow up on. So let's say for next week, come back around here for the live for next week. If I find anything good by next week, I'll mention it here. Even if it's like hey, we're going to go in more depth in the future, I'll let you know. But we can look through Constellation Pegasus interview recommendation. Yes, let me take a look. Let me take a look and see if they have an interest or if they're available to come in. Well, so yeah, this is one of those. Are they right? Darius here, he said, I thought the Therapeutae were Phoenician in origin. So within this space, right? Because they're a sect. They get called a sect within Alexandria and other parts of the Greek world, right? So you have connections for them, and there is oftentimes questions or discussion because of the context within. Yes, if they are also in this Alexandrian Greek space, if we have these communities at Elephantine, if there's this sect, this Jewish sect here, and if there's potentially another Jewish sect there, like, are these things connected to each other? Are they Phoenician in origin? And if we are saying they're Phoenician in origin, or if you're not, how do we say that? And what type of things might lead into conversion considerations? How are we knowing about them? How much do we know that comes from themselves versus how much comes from somebody else? So let me say, like, that's one. Let me look to see if there's somebody who can come in to kind of talk about this, because I think we've talked around in a lot about, concerns having to do with communities in Alexandria, or the regions surrounding here, because so much comes out of this. And if you love the Septuagint, some people really hate the Septuagint because of other things, but it's something worth poking around. So that might also be a topic to think of too, is just let's talk about what's happening in Alexandria and the types of influences that has around, because this is, these types of connections between things. I mean, it's the same type of communities and questions that you're gonna have when you're reading through stuff that talk about like materials connected to the Essene community, or texts surrounding the Dead Sea Scrolls, and how much of a relationship exists between these communities. Are they knowing each other, working with each other? Are they growing out of the same types of traditions? Are they fragmenting off, where we seem to have texts, between these types of things that, like, oh yes, this feels like they're in conversation and communion with each other, but does that mean that they are, or are they splinter groups? And different people have lots of different proposals depending the types of materials that you're going to see. If you're looking at something like the Damascus document compared to materials you find in the Qumran caves, but then also overlaps between these things and who knows what, that's can be a place of lots of arguments, let's say. And so I would expect there to be similar types of conversations. And one thing that can lead into this too is, like, when you're looking at a geographic region, proximity doesn't necessarily mean relationship. And so, like, that can be a weight that pulls on people's mind at time to say, okay, well, this community is nearby to this community and they have similar concerns along these lines. That must mean that they're connected. And sometimes that's correct, but it doesn't have to be correct. Like, there can be other reasons why they are existing there, and they may have very little to do with each other than, they might have some overlapping concerns in ways, but not necessarily connections in how they're going through those things. And those are the little places that I feel are really hard sometimes to explore in shorter and condensed ways, which might be why that could be a good thing to talk about in a longer interview. So K-Temps Bradford, let me hunt around and see where that might go for us, or how that could fit in, because you have, another thing we need to get to as well, I'd say, is we haven't done something like as a standalone piece on some of what we have with. We did an episode on, like, origins for ancient Israel. This is one with J.P. Dessel that came out at the beginning of last year. We kind of did it as a two-parter, right? Some of this stuff from the late Bronze Age, and then some of these models for origins, whether they're insider or outsider models. And something we touched on there, but didn't get into in depth in that one, is the same types of conversations that are happening for groups like, who are the Philistines, or, conversations of the Sea Peoples, or connections between Phoenicians and these spaces, and similar ideas and debates that happen regarding the emergence of this. Like, if we take the Sea Peoples as an example, a very famous example here, that you see these referenced, right? You have these descriptions within Egyptian monumental pieces discussing the invasions of Sea Peoples and also the defeat of them, but not such a clear idea of who they are, or how they end up, or where they go. And so that's where you're going to get into those conversations of, okay, is this a part of this collapse of the late Bronze Age world, where these groups are coming together, or individuals of various kinds are coming together and become these kind of scavenging or raiding parties that are moving across the Mediterranean? And do they have a clear origin point, or is their origin out of their need? Something you can see also in conversations regarding those references to the Habiru or the Apiru within the Amarna letters. And this is something we got an email on, because Expedition Bible recently did a video on the Amarna letters, and there's a lot within it. I'm gonna go about it in two ways. There's gonna be a shorter one that just kind of addresses some of this, what he's saying about the Habiru within this video. There will be a longer one probably it might just go to Patreon because his video is like 35 or 40 minutes long. And to break that one down on YouTube is gonna be a lot. So I think that one might live on Patreon, but there's gonna be something that comes to YouTube regarding his arguments of who are the Habiru within the Amarna letters. And so if you haven't heard of this before, there is an old argument that these references to the Habiru in the Amarna letters are references to the Hebrews, and that this is evidence and support for the emergence of the Hebrews out of the hill country within the region around the time of when, if you're taking an early Exodus date from the biblical chronology, doing it really strict, then maybe this lines up. And so you see these references to Habiru and early scholars first working through this, a number of these early scholars, and this is something that we talked about with Dr. Klein, but he talks about more in the book, who were looking for evidence of the Bible, right? You just have to say a lot of these early scholars are looking for evidence of the Bible as they find these Amarna letters. And this leads to people identifying Moses or Solomon in texts as they're trying to translate the cuneiform, which has been recently deciphered, and they're doing this incorrectly. Not everyone, but there are some who do and some who argue against it. And so within some of these early scholars, this is a proposal that comes forward. And Mendenhall is another who puts this proposal forward. However, it's a proposal that's viewed very negatively now. It's not something that is held by the scholarly community as being a real connection there, that this is a sound connection, right? Maybe your ear can hear it and want to lead you to it, but as we unpack more and more of these letters, that description doesn't quite line up, because it usually goes, oh, well, they're here, and look, they're attacking cities, and that aligns with some of what we have. If the Israelites were entering into the land and they're attacking cities, wouldn't this be the same community? Except we have to ask more questions about the Amarna letters themselves, because can you take them at face value? Right? There were the reports of these little city-state kings to the Egyptian kings, and can you trust them? Can you believe what they have to say? They also use this designation, yes, to describe these people who are loosely defined and identified that are attacking them, but they also use it against the rulers of other city-states, saying like they're connecting with them, they are participating with them, they're helping them, they have become them. So is that the same? And this is what has led most scholars to say, no, that's not the connection that happens. And yeah, Expedition Bible, it is, yes, I think it is fair to say, a pseudo-archaeology channel that has a real hard connection to wanting to establish this early Exodus date. And that's his intent in that Amarna video, to say we have in old scholarly arguments this connection proposed. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear that he says, early scholars said this, and then now these liberal scholars don't agree anymore and they have it wrong. Well, the reason why, not just liberal scholars, but the reason why scholars don't agree with that anymore is we understand those materials better. We understand the context of the Amarna letters better. We understand the Amarna letters themselves better. We understand the archaeology of the region better, right? Our knowledge has just grown. And so what was proposed then doesn't check out anymore. And so you don't have to stuff those things together, because they don't work. And doing so hinders your ability to understand what we do have. But it does leave this question of we don't really know who the Habiru are. Who are they? But they do align with movements within some of this period that kind of gives you this indication that, there are these large city-state systems, varying sizes when we use large here, but that exist. But there are also persons who are on the margins of those spaces. And some of that leads people to, when we're looking at these models of origin, is this one of those insider models that out of those who have been pushed to the side by these other systems, when those systems break and the late Bronze Age collapse, some of this can carry over. And so they are not, right? This isn't a strong connection to make here. It's not a compelling argument. It's not something that scholars hold in high esteem, but it is something, if you just want to say, old scholars said this, yes, there are a number of old scholars first working through the Amarna letters who did say that. But first or oldest doesn't mean most accurate. As we get more information, things can change. And over time, right, you can see developments, and sometimes, and idea that was proposed early is refined and strengthened over time as we find more materials. That happens. It doesn't have to be that the oldest thing is wrong. It depends on what comes after it. What else do we find? How do we understand things? And so you can see it working sometimes to the detriment of those old proposals and sometimes in support of those old proposals, and sometimes just needing refinement of older proposals, that something was put forward, and over time, as scholars continue to pick away at it little bit by little bit, they get narrower and narrower and more refined and fragmented off in different ways. So there are proposals, like, are they connected to some of the tribal systems? There's proposals that maybe they are connected to these different groups, because we do have a variety of possible connections there. But there isn't something that is like widely accepted as, yes, they must be this group. And something that we should also have to say here in this is, just because this is something that comes up in his video, just because the community of the Hebrew Bible says they're the ones who destroyed some of these cities, and we have references to a group in the Amarna letters attacking cities, doesn't mean that those confirm each other. In the same way that we've talked about with the things like Jericho, like you can make a claim to something that you didn't do. That's possible. And it also opens the door, like, maybe there are overlaps between these things. So that's not like a one-to-one to say, well, it shows up in this way in the Amarna letters, and it shows up to this way of the descriptions within the text. And so those that is missing a lot of the other context that you need, that if you're reading through things, there can be helpful material in that. I'd say if you're interested in more of this, 1, check out the interview next week that's coming out with Dr. Eric Klein. 2, check out his book, Love, War, and Diplomacy. 3, I'd say go back and watch our interviews with J.P. Dessel from the beginning of this year. We have 2, one of them dealing with some materials from the Late Bronze Age, like the Merneptah Stele and what that says, how we should understand those contexts, and then another on some theories of origin. He also has a great chapter in an edited volume. It's linked in that in the second video, walking through what are some of these theories of origin. And so if you're looking for a place to start, that's like a good, helpful overview of, here are the prominent theories. Here's how those have developed over time. It's a great piece to go and read through. So that's linked in that first one. I'll put links to those older videos, those podcasts, down in the description here. And so you can come through some of that. But check those things out. I would say don't go and watch the Expedition Bible video for valuable information. Some of what he provides is like, yes, that is how that letter is read, but also not all in the same way. Because he makes unsurprisingly a big deal about Abdi Heba's letter about, Jerusalem is like a ship on the sea. And this is one that is very famous and gets pointed to a lot. But do we trust him when he says this? When he says that I'm all in, like, should you be trusting this small city-state ruler who is trying to appeal for help while also making his enemies look bad? He's positioning himself to say, I'm the only one who is loyal to you. Do you trust him when he says that? Or do you not trust him when he says that? So there's enough on that, but there will be some things that come out from us in the future that has to do with that. Sorry, a little behind on chat. Let's go through. Nick from Detroit, just to back up, rejection of scriptures by atheist archaeologists was the problem. I'd say here, like, this is a place where I would say, like, I'm not saying that when archaeologists of belief or unbelief, they're not looking to ideally confirm or disprove any text, but to say, let's excavate and let's see what the excavation says. And if it can inform our reading of a text, that's wonderful. It always can inform our reading of a text, but just in what way? So does it have to prove that? If someone is coming in and saying, I'm rejecting wholesale everything that comes from this text, that's not great, because that text emerges over a wide variety of periods of time. And we do have some pieces that say, like, okay, we got a description of something here, and look, we do have archaeological evidence that corroborates, not one-to-one, but gives a different perspective of a similar kind of event. And so there are people who will say, like, yeah, those things exist. They're not rejecting that, but what they might be rejecting is the need to wholesale accept all of those things together. And so when you're talking to archaeologists about this, if they are presenting to you, I would say either side, that you have to accept everything that the text says and use that to interpret the archaeology, or reject everything that the text says in order to interpret the archaeology, you're going to be in a position that's not trying to read the archaeology for what the archaeology is. Right? That is a middle ground that should exist, that really does exist. I think this is one of those places where that is much more common than seems to exist, depending on kind of the content streams that we live in or that we get fed, or what maybe gets picked up in news articles. That the majority of the scholarly community, the archaeological community, is just, what is it? What's in the dirt? And then this is what is here. And where does this go? Where does this go? So I'd say like that's, there are a number of old theories to cling to or rail against. Yeah, so this is a common thing within this, and is a difficulty. Like, let's be honest, this is a difficulty about staying up to date with the scholarship, which is a hard thing because there's always stuff coming out. There's always new excavation reports. There's new journal articles. There's new books, and so staying up to date on how theories are progressing or how the material is changing over time, because little changes from another site can really impact how we're understanding what we do have. So it may not even be coming from one excavation itself, but another excavation has found something that might need to change the way we're understanding a period of time that informs things that are happening at another site. And so that's a difficulty about working in this space, because you have to stay up to date. And if you're just relying on old materials, especially if they are 100, 150 years old, I mean, like, let's say like you're 100 years old if you're going back, but even some of this is older than that. Yeah, you're missing a lot of information. You're missing a lot of valuable information. It's like if you're reading a Bible translation that is from before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's going to be holes in the way they're understanding the text that has been filled in more completely by the discovery of manuscripts in more recent times. So there's a couple things here with Habiru text and Megiddo, right? These are some of those places where there are things that there are attacks on some of these cities that do describe or do align with described attacks within biblical records. But those cities also bear evidence from attacks over multiple periods because they're prominent cities within these regions. And so it's not just a place that has been attacked one time and only one time, and only has one destruction layer or one sign of this, right? We have within these letters multiple appeals because of ongoing attacks in ways that complicate just, well, this must be aligned with that. But we'll talk about that more. We'll talk about that more in that longer video. And so no discovery should automatically be assumed to be proving a biblical passage, but neither should it be automatically rejected because it's mentioned in the Bible. We're on the same page on that, right? It shouldn't automatic one way or another is going to be problematic. And so it's as those things build over time. So yes, I would say it should not be automatically assumed to prove it. And it shouldn't be automatically rejected just because it is, because this is one of those places where you have things like, let's talk about the Siloam Tunnel inscription, right? So we have this reference in the Hebrew Bible of, hey, we're making this thing, we've done this thing, and then you go, and you can go and walk through the tunnel today. And they found in the tunnel, right, a description of how this happens. Now, it's not exactly the same, right? But you have these descriptions that connect to each other. And this is one of those things when we're looking at the text over time, depending on what part, and I'd say maybe this is something to add into the mix of like, well, what period are we reading when we're reading in the Hebrew Bible? Like, that can change over time with how it's framing itself, what type of literature it is trying to be, right? That's a big deal. When we're moving into things like Chronicles, it's functioning very differently. It is trying to be very different than something like the book of Genesis, right? Those are different. They're different. They're both in the Hebrew Bible, but they're very different in what they're trying to do, how they're trying to do it. You can see it when you read through them. And there's overlaps and things like, okay, there's genealogical concerns in both. But even the way it's moving through those genealogies is different. Yes, so the inscription is not in the tunnel anymore. It was discovered in the tunnel. It's been removed. It is not there anymore. You can't see that there anymore. So yes, very fair. Just saying, like, as they were finding, when they discovered it, it was discovered in situ, in place within the tunnel itself. But the texts themselves speak to us in different ways. They come about things in different perspectives. They're trying to do things that are a little bit differently. So that's something to keep in mind too as we look to these different periods of time that they're describing, the archaeology that might be connected to some of those things. It's interesting. In your studies, do you ever go digging into books published in the 1800s, early 1900s, just to see what early archaeologists? Yes, it is very interesting to go back and look at some of those early descriptions, some of the early field reports, some of the early analysis from this. And if you're reading something like, if you got some free time on your hands, read some PhD dissertations, especially ones that are dealing with like the archaeology of sites, because they will get into these weeds to say, from the beginning, right, here's the arguments that have been made, here's the materials that we have over time. And you can see sometimes people are way off, and other times people are maybe closer than you would expect. They've only found a little bit, and this is also a place where excavation process has really changed. And so it can be interesting and sometimes, disheartening to see, well, what are they saying and how are they coming about doing it? How much did they really excavate in order to make that argument? What did they really find? How did they identify it? What did they do in order to do those things? Or is there a large argument that's built on a little bit of material? That happens too. So it can be, yes, very interesting to unpack some of that. For this week, I'm going to have to wrap today up. I have to run. But thank you so much for tuning in. If you are here live, appreciate you. Thank you for joining into the chat. If you are watching on replay, happy to have you. We'll be back next week. Bob and I will be back next week in the afternoon, a little bit of a later date next week. These kind of swing around on Friday depending on schedule, but we'll try to get them. I'll try to get them up a little bit earlier so you can see what time they are going to be at. But if you weren't here and you want to ask a question, leave it in the chat. If you weren't here and you're wanting to throw a question our way that we'll get to, you can join us over on Patreon. You can send us questions there. We got bonus content over there too. And we're going to be doing some more bonus interviews over there because I've got like a stack of books that we've got to go through. And by we, I mean, with you, a stack of books. And so we're going to do some bonus author interviews over there. Some stuff that is, I'd say, maybe a little more technical. Like let's get into the details, even maybe a little bit more than what I think might be of interest to people who are coming across some of the stuff. Not all of you, right? But if you're interested in that really in the weedsy kind of stuff, we're going to have some more of those kinds of interviews. I try to mix a little bit of that back and forth in our other interviews of like, let's start with establishing the basics and we need to know some of this, and then let's get into depth and we can return to more, and we'll do some more of that over there. And a part of that is always fun because it's just like, even if you know, like even if you think you know and you've read things, your understanding of it can be so different coming from the same place, or your interpretation, or just little nuances. And so that's one of the best parts about all these conversations is you just get to hear like just slight turns and different perspectives on these things. And that's what we love, because I'm here to continue learning with you, right? Like this is an ongoing learning experience for all of us because no one knows it all. And there's lots of really smart people out there that are happy to share their insights. So that's what we want to find for you. Yeah, happy to go through comments. Thank you for joining. Thank you for commenting in. Happy to be able to chat with some of you live. Really appreciate it. But for this week, I'm going to sign off here. Thanks so much for your support. Thanks for tuning in. Elephantine interview is great. Can't plug it enough. Go take a listen if you're looking for something right now, or if you're looking for something to do over the weekend. It's a great one. Also worth mentioning, if you want to get into the weeds on some of that stuff, right? Some of these papyri, there's a link in the description of that, right? One, to a book that Dr. Moore published with Brill that gets into that. But two, Ohio State, where Dr. Moore works, they have a digital collection of materials that you can go and peruse, that you can just go and look through and learn about. So go and dig in. If you're wanting to go and see some of that material, right? Not with your hands, but virtually as best we can, go and do that. So there's a link for that collection inside the description for that interview as well. I wanted to make sure that we could include that because it's one of those things where the internet has, I don't know, let's just be nice and say the internet has problems, right? We can all agree on this. But it also has other things like the digital editions of Aramaic and Phoenician sources from Ohio State University. The link is in the interview with Dr. Moore. You can go and look through. So go and check it out. Have a great weekend. Go Hawks. Hopefully we beat Oregon this week. I kept it to the end, but we're playing Oregon this week. And if we can do this, the Hawkeyes, don't sleep on them. Okay, don't sleep on them. But we'll leave football aside. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, thank you so much. Until next time.